Hi, thank you today for the opportunity to introduce Catherine White. Catherine is a 59-year-old woman who has lived experience with severe mental distress and has struggled with coexisting difficulties with substance abuse for a very long time. Her experience with alcohol abuse and mental health issues started 20 years ago, where she experienced severe bullying and sexual harassment at her workplace. In order to deal with extreme anxiety and aggression at work, she turned to alcohol as her coping mechanism. This started a cycle where she was turning to alcohol to numb her mind and her feelings during times of mental distress, which became more and more frequent and more prolonged, and came to a point where she couldn't cope with alcohol in her daily life. Catherine's relationship with alcohol abuse has been ongoing and one that has had intervals of recovery and relapse. She is still on her way to recovery. She has been battling this issue by seeking help, by going to rehabilitation programs, and reaching out to community-based organizations such as EACH. She has reached lows where she felt that suicide was the only way out. This is when she's reached out to Lifeline, who connected her to partners in recovery, which she found very helpful. Catherine speaks about her experience with EACH as a turning point where she had a doctor who specialized in addiction, as well as a psychologist and an art therapist, and an outreach worker as well. It was this holistic approach which helped support her recovery in a sustainable way. Catherine speaks about, throughout her recovery process, she has had a dual diagnosis of chronic complex post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol abuse. This medical model framework has helped Catherine make sense of her experience, although it wasn't black and white from the start. She felt relieved after receiving the PTSD diagnosis because it gave her something to work with at the time. She wasn't someone who simply just had an alcohol problem. There was an underlying issue there, which was trauma. However, the psychologist who diagnosed her with PTSD didn't necessarily make the connection between alcohol addiction and trauma and mental health. He failed to validate the distress of Catherine's alcohol abuse, which made her feel ashamed, embarrassed, and as a result didn't help with her addiction issues at that time, which resulted in her relapsing. During the second phase of her recovery, Catherine had a GP who had a more holistic approach and was able to understand the link between addiction and mental health. This was extremely helpful for Catherine, as it allowed her to receive the care that she needed and make sense of her experience. Catherine found it helpful when her trauma background was recognized, which allowed her to make sense of her experience. Trauma from her childhood of being bullied was having a huge impact on her mental health, with bullying and harassment at her workplace triggering Catherine's anxiety and ability to cope. She realized that her alcohol use and PTSD were inherently interlinked. She had tried to turn to alcohol in order to process the PTSD, which manifested into an addiction. Then she sought help in various ways, but it would bring out so much suppressed trauma to a point where she couldn't deal with it, and she would turn to alcohol again. It was a vicious cycle. The GP, who had a holistic understanding of the links between trauma and mental health, was able to intervene and provide the care and medication that Catherine needed, which ultimately helped her on her road to recovery. Here, Catherine found the medical model and trauma-informed model framework helpful in making sense of her experience. The power threat meaning framework applies to how Catherine has made sense of her continual experience of being bullied and harassed at the workplace, with alcohol used as a coping mechanism to respond to that threat. It also shows how messages from the wider society, including friends and family, have increased feelings of shame, humiliation, isolation, and fear. Catherine speaks about how social stigma and discrimination relating to addiction and mental health were ultimately what brought her down during her times of severe mental distress. Feelings of isolation and loss of connection were what drove her to mental distress and to resort to addiction. Catherine speaks about how she is currently studying for a dual diagnosis certificate program at TAFE and has become a member of the Eastern Region Dual Diagnosis Council, facilitating meetings to support people struggling with mental health and addiction. Catherine is using her lived experience with dual diagnosis as an opportunity to help others and advocate for people struggling with mental distress and addiction issues. Catherine is utilizing what was once her vulnerability and weakness as a strength in order to help the recovery of not only herself but also others. Catherine uses her story to generate meaning and hope, leading to acceptance and validation. This demonstrates the power threat meaning framework. Through her lived experience with alcohol addiction, trauma, and mental distress, Catherine is able to connect with other people with similar lived experiences. She talks about how opening up about her own experiences can help others open up about theirs, which can develop better understanding around AOD and trauma, to empathize and empower others with similar lived experiences. Hence, peer support programs such as Partners in Recovery is a very helpful program. Catherine also speaks about the need to raise awareness of the link between mental health and addiction for consumers. Integration of mental health and AOD in a more flexible way is critical in helping people who are dual diagnosed like Catherine. People living with mental health and AOD issues should be able to seek help, whether their addiction is sorted or not. At the moment, many services refuse to help unless consumers are no longer using alcohol. This excludes people from mental health support care if they're struggling with AOD. When people are under the influence, their brains aren't able to cope and process properly. So therapy is important for them to be able to be directed into the right path. Catherine highlights the need for GPs to have a trauma-informed approach to understand addiction and the connection to mental health. GPs also need to have knowledge and awareness of dual diagnosis. Catherine emphasizes that a holistic approach to mental health care is critical, where integrated services and information sharing is present. Consumers shouldn't have to retell their stories over and over again to avoid re-traumatization. When Catherine talks about her experience, a holistic care where the GP, psychologist, AOD counselor are all in the loop in her care, was helpful in her recovery. Holistic support for mental health recovery involves looking at all aspects of the person's issues, putting in place a range of safety nets and support so that if one falls over, the person can lift themselves with another. Thank you for the opportunity today for allowing me to share Catherine's story with you.